Welcome to Chapter 19 of The Bark Covered House by William Knowlin. This chapter is titled Trees, very appropriately. There were two stately trees which stood near the center of the place. In view of their antiquity, it seemed almost wrong to cut them. One was an elm which stood on the flat of the ecorse. The other was what we called a swamp white oak. It stood in a little hollow at the west end of the ridge where we lived, about 20 rods north of the elm. They appeared as though they were about the same age. They were nearly the same size. They were 5 or 6 feet through the butt. Father often said that the tree recorded within itself a true record of its own age. After a tree was cut down, I have known him frequently to count the grains or yearly rings, and from them extract a register by which he learned how many years old it was. How my mind reaches back 40 years and views again that venerable old oak and elm. Trees whose history and lives began before the first settlement of America. How familiar still their appearance to me as they stood with their arms outstretched, bidding me the most graceful salutations. They seemed almost like friends, at least there was some companionship about them. Their forms were very familiar to me. On the west side of the elm, just above the ground and running up about 6 feet, there was a huge knot which grew out of the side of the tree. It was large enough to stand upon. When upon it, there was not room enough for us to stand upon it and chop. We had to build a scaffold around the tree, up even with the top of the knot to stand upon. And in that way, we were able to cut the great tree down. It was a hard job and was attended with danger. When the tree started, we had to get down very quickly and run back to a place of safety, for the tree was very angry in the last throes of its dissolution. It broke other trees down, tore other trees to pieces, broke off their limbs, bent small ones down with it as it went, and held their tops to the earth. And other trees went nearly down with it but were fortunate enough to break its hold and gain their equilibrium with such swiftness that their limbs, which had been nearly broken off, yet which they retained until they strengthened, then their stopping so sudden, the reaction caused the fractured and dry limbs to break loose, and they flew back to where we had been chopping. They flew like missiles of death through the air, and the scaffold upon which we stood but a minute before was smashed into slivers. And in the meantime, we were looking out for our own safety. No man, unless he has experienced it himself, can have an adequate idea of the danger and the labor of clearing a farm in heavy timbered land. Then he knows something of the anxieties and hardships of a life in the woods. The walking, the chopping, the sweating, the running, the dodging like Indians behind trees. He trusts to their protection to save him from falling trees and flying limbs, although he is often lacerated and bruised, jabbed and torn by them. I knew a man and a boy in our town who were killed by falling limbs. Sometimes he is cut by the axe and is obliged to go home over logs between stumps, through brush, leaving a bloody trail behind him. Father's farm was rescued from the wilderness and consecrated to the plow, husbandry through sweat and blood. We oftentimes encountered perils and were weary from labor, oftentimes hungry and thirsty, often suffered from cold and heat, frequently destitute of comfortable apparel, and condemned to toil as the universal doom of humanity, and thus earning our bread by the sweat of our brow. Father and I labored some years in sight of the great elm stump. It appeared like a giant, with a great hump on his back, overlooking the surrounding stumps. It was about 8 feet high, but it was doomed to decay and entirely disappeared long years ago. The oak tree was more fortunate and escaped the fatal axe. A number of years after all the timber around it had been chopped and cleared away, on account of its greatness, and its having so nice a body, Father let it stand as a monarch of the clearing. But few came into our clearing without seeing His Majesty's presence. His roots were immense. They had been centuries creeping and feeling their way along, extracting life from Mother Earth to sustain their gigantic body. The acorn from which that oak grew must have been planted long before, and the tree which grew from it had been dressed many times in its summer robe of green, and it was doubtless flourishing when the Mayflower left the English Channel. When she was slowly making her way from billow to billow, though then through the almost unknown sea, bearing some most brave and liberty-loving men and women the world at that time could produce. When the hearts of the Pilgrim Fathers were beating high with hopes of liberty and escaping from tyranny, when their breath came low and short for fear of what might await them, when they landed on the American shore, yes, when that little band of pilgrims were kneeling on Plymouth Rock and were offering up thanksgiving and praise to the Almighty who had brought them safely over the trackless deep, that oak was quietly standing, gathering strength to make it what it was when we came to Michigan. There it stood ever since the days of yore, spreading its boughs over the generations of men who have long since passed away. Around it had been the Indians' camping and hunting ground. When we came to plow and to work the ground, near it I found some of their stone arrows which had been worked out very beautifully. Their edges and points showed very plainly where they had been chipped off in making. We also found stone hatchets, the bits of which were about 2.5 inches broad and worked to an edge. They were about 6 inches long. The pole or head was round, and from their appearance they must have been held in the hand, using the arm for a helve, for an encounter with Bruin or any other enemy. It is possible they were bound with withy around the pole and used that as a handle. Much ingenuity and skill must have been required to work out their implements when they had nothing better with which to do it than other stones. I often picked up the arrows and hatchets and saved them as relics of past ages, knowing that they'd been in other hands long years before. I have some of them now in 1875. The stones from which they were made must have been brought from some distance, as there were but few other stones found in this part of the country. If that oak could have talked, what a wild, wild story it might have told, not only of lost arrows and hatchets, but also of their owners, about whom the world has little knowledge. It might have told also of the hundreds of years it had stood there and showered down its acorns upon the earth, enough in one season to have planted a forest of its own kind. How often its acorns have been gathered by the Indian youth and devoured by the wild beasts of the forest. How many times its leaves have been changed by the autumn frost from green to a beautiful golden hue. How the cold wind swept them off and flew them down in hurtled races to the ground, carpeted and cushioned the earth and protected the roots and enriched the soil. How, after it had been shorn of its leaf, its life current had been sent back through the pores of its body to its roots and congealed by the cold freezing frosts of winter, how the wind sighed and moaned through its branches while it cracked and snapped with the frost, but there was to be an end to its existence. The remorseless axe was laid at its roots, and there is nothing left of it, unless it be a few old oak rails. There are some moss-covered rails on the place yet, that were made at an early day. How my thoughts go back and linger round that old oak whose branches gave shelter to the deer and furnished them with food and protected the Indian and his home, the place where I so long afterward advanced to manhood. It is no wonder that Boston men are so careful in protecting their trees. With their usual care and foresight, they have guarded the celebrated elm on Boston Common. Thousands of American people from every state in the Union, even from the Pacific Coast, visit the beautiful city of Boston, but are not satisfied until they visit the ancient elm. and read its history, as far as known, from the iron plate, and gaze with admiration on the wonderful tree and the fence that surrounds it. The full history of that tree is not known, but it reaches back prior to the settlement of Boston. It was a good-sized tree in 1656. A map of Boston made in 1722 showed the tree as one of the principal objects. That tree is a sacred relic of the past. Its branches waved over the heads of honored colonial ancestors. Trees are our most beautiful and best antiquities. It was a beautiful thought, said Ruskin, when God thought of making a tree and giving it a life so long. And another says, what vicissitudes mark its life? Almost tender with suggestion, trees are the Methuselahs of nature. The famous Etna chestnut is 1,000 years old. There is a cypress tree in Mexico, over 40 feet in diameter, whose zones record nearly 3,000 years. The baobab trees of the Green Cape are fully 4,000 years old. The great dragon tree at Ortova, Tenerife, recently said to be dying, is said to be 5,000 years old. A life that runs parallel to almost the entire period of human chronology. No doubt some of those trees will last as long as time. Is it any wonder that I claim some companionship to trees, since I passed so many years of my youth among them? Trees often prevented sharp eyes from seeing me, secreted me, and helped me to luck, which was very gratifying to me. Trees, when it rained and the wind was piercing, have often protected and sheltered and kept me dry and comfortable for hours. Frequently, when at some distance from home, hunting and the night coming on began traveling, as I suppose towards home, I often came to the tracks in the snow which at first I thought were made by someone else. But upon a more particular examination, I would find that they were my own tracks, and then I would know that I had been circling round and round, and that the wigwam was lost. And I had the gloomy prospect of remaining in the woods all night, out of humanity's reach. And then I would trust to the trees, look at them, take their directions, and start again, in a new course. And this would seem wrong to me, but it always came out right. Trees never deceived, but showed me the way home. When I had been in the woods, hungry, trees furnished me with food. When thirsty, they often supplied me with drink. When cold and almost freezing, trees have warmed and made me comfortable. Trees furnished most of the material for Father's bark-covered house, which sheltered us for more than 2 years. If trees have done so much for one, surely all humanity have derived great good from them. The earth itself is adorned and beautified by trees. A beautiful chapter by William Knowlin about trees, and he speaks of two very, very particular trees. And trees are so much like landmarks, aren't they? We use them when we're traveling and just recognizing our environment, and someone or we have to take down, or we lose a big tree, and all of a sudden the entire environment has changed. Our situation has changed. It takes a while to get used to that idea. The property that we live on right now, occasionally, very occasionally, I remember driving by that property as we were driving someplace. It was kind of on a back road to a place we didn't go often, but we went. And I remember looking down the road that borders our property on one side, and there was a huge tree, and it had branches that sort of went over the top of the road because it was very close to the edge of the road, and it was probably a tree that was 3.5, maybe 4 feet in diameter. It was a big tree, and it had branches that reached over the road, and it kind of made a circle, so that as you look down the road, the tree was very much a landmark. And even now, there's remnants of the roots of that tree on that hillside right by the road. And I remember what it looked like before that tree was lost. There's also a tree on the north side of our property. It's a bur oak tree that's just enormous. Again, 3 or 4 feet through the butt, as he would say it, in diameter as it goes. Just a giant tree. It's not a tree that's good for lumber because the main trunk of the tree isn't very tall before it gets to just huge branches, which is typical of these trees that get left sort of in the middle of a field or on a fence line. They're not very good for timber, but they're huge stately trees, and so they're left by whoever owns the property. Maybe on this property line tree is right on the line, and so neither owner thought they had the right to cut down this tree, and they never got together and said, boy, we really need to take this tree down. And recently I talked to the neighbor. He really wanted to take that tree down because it blocks his field in some ways. And I said, well, I would let you take down any other tree on the property line, but that particular tree, because it's a landmark to me. It's a tree that I don't want to disappear. So really neat chapter out of the Bark Covered House, and one that's kind of near and dear to me, because as many trees as we cut down for our projects, just like in the Bark Covered House, they're cutting down trees for very, very particular reasons. They don't cut down trees for the fun of it. They cut down trees because they need that ground, or they need the trees, whatever purpose there is in that circumstance. They were trying to make it so that they could farm. The only way that they could do that was to take down lots and lots of trees. Here we are in Maine. It's an amazing environment because it is basically all trees. Wherever you go in Maine, it's all trees. But you know what? If you look at pictures from the late 19th century, and if you read about things in the 18th century, many places here that are now just fully forested were completely barren of trees in the late 18th century and in the 19th century. It is impossible to imagine this environment without all the trees that it has now. Amazing. Thank you so much for coming along on this journey, this chapter about the Bark Covered House by William Knowlin, and we will see you again for the next chapter. Thanks for joining me, and I hope you have a great day.